Have you ever loved someone so deeply that when they were gone, a part of you just stopped living too? Graham Whitmore had everything: wealth, power, and a name that made people step aside. But none of it could fill the silence left by the woman he lost 10 years ago. Then came the will, a cruel condition from his late father: marry within 90 days or lose the company. Would you sign your heart away just to protect what you built? Would you let a stranger into the ruins of your most private grief? When Graham agrees to a marriage of convenience with a woman he barely knows, he thinks it's just business. But what if love finds its way in quietly, not through fireworks, but through firelight, soft silences, and the haunting memory of a life once saved? What would you do if the person you pushed away was the one who once saved your life without ever asking for thanks? This is not just a love story. It's a story about grief, redemption, and learning to choose again when you thought love was gone for good. Like, share, and subscribe if you're ready to begin this unforgettable journey. Now, let's step into the snow-covered silence, where everything begins. The snow hadn't quite settled in Montana yet, but the sky above the Whitmore estate was the color of unspoken things: gray, silent, thick with a kind of weight that made even time seem to hesitate. Inside, behind tall windows framed with aging oak trim, Graham Whitmore sat in the same leather chair he'd occupied for the last 3 winters. His office was warm, but the man wasn't. A fire crackled faintly in the hearth. Books lined the shelves around him, orderly, untouched. Every inch of the room felt carefully managed, like the rest of his life, except for one single page lying on his desk, curling ever so slightly at the corner. It was a clause, a condition in his late father's will, and it had just become real. Graham turned his glass slowly between his fingers, the amber liquid barely moving. He hadn't taken a sip. Not yet. Not since this morning when Harlan brought the envelope. Harlan Myers, his attorney, friend, and, occasionally, reluctant truth-teller, stood across from him now. Patient, calm, but watching. "You have until February 15th, Harlan said, his voice gentle but firm. "That gives you 81 days. Graham didn't look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the fire. "You're telling me," he murmured, "that unless I marry someone by that date, I lose controlling interest in Whitmore Holdings?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." The room fell silent again, except for the fire. Harlan crossed the space and placed the will back into its folder. "It wasn't meant as a punishment," he added. "Your father, he just believed in legacy, continuity." Graham let out a short, humorless breath. "My father believed in leverage," he said, "even from the grave." Harlan didn't argue. There were truths that didn't need rebuttals. It had been 10 years since Graham's wife, Charlotte, died. 10 years since he came back from the hospital to an empty house and started removing pieces of her from each room, like dismantling a shrine. First the pictures, then her coats, her gardening gloves. He told himself it was healing, but really, it was hiding. Since then, Graham built Whitmore Holdings into one of the most influential privately owned real estate firms in the country. He negotiated land, power, and partnerships with a precision that left rivals baffled. But when it came to people emotions, he drew sharp lines. He wasn't cruel, just closed. Harlan walked to the window, arms crossed. "There are ways to do this, Graham. Quietly, you could marry someone with a legal agreement, just enough to satisfy the clause. You don't have to live with her." You don't even have to know. Graham's voice cut across the room. Not loud, but final. I won't stage a circus. I won't drag someone into this and pretend. Harlan turned. It doesn't have to be pretending. Not if you choose right. Graham stood and moved toward the fire, finally taking a sip of his drink. His eyes flicked toward the folder on the desk. What are you not saying? Harlan hesitated, then pulled a second envelope from his briefcase and laid it beside the will. I've met someone. She's not conventional. She doesn't come from our circles. No ties to your competitors. No online footprint. No hidden agendas. She's someone I met through the rebuilding program we've been funding. Graham raised an eyebrow. A charity case. No, Harlan said, without flinching. She's not looking for a way out. She's looking for something honest. Her name is Marin Clark. She's 36, independent, strong-minded, and if you let her speak, Auntie, I think you'll listen. Graham didn't answer. He just stared at the flames, jaw tight. It had been a long time since he let anyone new into his world, a longer time since he let anyone stay. That night, Graham stood alone in the kitchen. He poured himself another drink, but didn't touch it. Instead, he walked out to the porch. The cold hit him in the chest, like a truth he didn't want to admit. He remembered something Charlotte once said years ago, when they were still in love and still invincible. A home isn't the walls. It's who waits for you on the other side of the door. No one waited for him now. Not really. Just lawyers, deadlines, and 81 days. The first time Graham Whitmore saw Marin Clark, she was kneeling on a dusty porch with a hammer in one hand and a chipped mug of coffee in the other. Her jeans were torn at the knees, a smudge of paint on her cheek, and the winter wind tangled her dark brown hair into a loose, practical bun. It wasn't the image he had expected. She didn't glance up when he stepped out of the car. She didn't freeze or flutter or look surprised. She simply drove the nail into the wooden plank, steady, deliberate. Then she took a sip of her coffee and stood, brushing off her hands. You must be Graham, she said plainly. Her voice wasn't high or soft or overly polite. It was clear, low, like someone who had learned long ago that silence had power and words should be used carefully. He nodded. I was told, you're considering stay. Proposal, she added, watching him without flinching. Not the romantic kind, more like logistical. Graham's lips tightened. You make it sound like a building permit. Marin gave a one-shoulder shrug. You're not here for love. I'm not here for money. We both know this is paperwork dressed in formal wear. There was no bitterness in her tone, just honesty. He studied her more closely. She had no jewelry, no makeup. Her coat was old but clean, and her eyes hazel, maybe green, were calm, not sharp, not guarded, just aware. He'd met thousands of people, business leaders, socialites, women who played games behind soft smiles. But Marin Clark. She looked him in the eye and stood as if she had nothing to prove, no interest in impressing him. And somehow, that unsettled him more than if she had tried. They sat across from each other inside the small break room of the volunteer site. Someone offered them coffee, and she accepted, adding 1 sugar. Graham declined. Harlan sat between them, silent but present, watching Graham carefully for any sign of reaction. I don't usually say yes to things like this, Marin began, turning her cup slowly in her hands. But Harlan told me about your situation, and about the clause. She glanced up, I didn't agree to meet you because I needed money. I'm not drowning. I live within my means. I take care of my mom. I design small interiors for shops and coffee houses when they let me. I say this because I don't want pity. I only came here to ask one thing." Graham leaned forward, intrigued despite himself, which is, "Don't lie to me." The words weren't sharp. They weren't desperate, but they cut deeper than he expected. "I don't care if this is just a contract to you," Marin said, setting her cup down. "I don't care if there are cameras or lawyers or dinner parties with people who call me darling while thinking I'm disposable." She met his gaze without blinking. "But if you want me to stand next to you for the next few months, maybe longer, I need one thing in return." "What's that?" "Don't pretend with me when no one's watching." Outside, the wind had picked up. Dust danced along the gravel lot as gray clouds rolled across the late November sky. Graham stood by his car, hand resting on the open door. Marin had walked him out, hands in the pockets of her worn coat. "I'm not trying to fix you," she said quietly. Before he left, "I don't even know you." He paused. "I just think," she continued, voice softer now, "that maybe you've been standing in a burning house for a long time and forgot you could walk out." Graham didn't reply. He drove away, but her words followed him all the way back to Montana. That night, he didn't sleep, not because of deadlines, not even because of the clause, but because of a woman he had known for less than an hour who didn't ask for anything, didn't beg, didn't posture, and yet left behind a silence that wasn't cold. It was honest. 3 days later, Marin received a manila envelope in her small mailbox. No fanfare, no signature, just a typed note inside. "If you're still willing, you have 81 days to tolerate me. The garden's a mess. Gee." She smiled just a little and folded the letter with careful hands. Then she started packing. Montana, in early December, felt like the pause between heartbeats. The first snow hadn't stuck yet, but the air carried that kind of stillness, like the land was holding its breath. Trees stood bare, stretched against a pale sky. The wind had softened, but the cold came steady now, like memory. The Whitmore estate stood quietly at the edge of a long gravel road, surrounded by acres of untamed field and hills that rolled toward a horizon no one could quite reach. It wasn't the kind of place that welcomed people. Not anymore. But on a Wednesday morning, a dusty red Subaru crept up the driveway. Its tires crunched against frostbitten gravel. And when it stopped, Marin Clark stepped out, one hand gripping a canvas bag, the other tightening her scarf. She stood still for a moment. The house was massive, stoic. Its white stone facade seemed almost reluctant to greet her. But Marin didn't flinch. She adjusted her coat, closed the car door gently, and started walking toward the front steps. The door opened before she knocked. "Right on time," Graham said. He wasn't smiling. He didn't reach for her bag. But there was a quiet in his voice that felt less guarded. The contract was signed at the kitchen table. 2 cups of coffee. 1 signature each. No ceremony. No questions. It was clear, simple, and precise. They would be legally married before the end of the month. The marriage would be valid for a minimum of 6 months. Both parties agreed to live under one roof and attend public functions together. No expectations of intimacy, no interference in personal time or work. Absolute discretion outside of agreed public appearances. Marin added one line in her own handwriting. "In all private moments, honesty takes priority over performance." Graham read the line, then looked at her. You still want that? I think it's the only way this won't destroy both of us, she said. He didn't argue. The guest room was upstairs at the far end of the hall. Clean, spare, a soft blue throw across a white linen duvet. Marin dropped her bag by the closet and stood by the window, looking out across the fields. It was beautiful in the way old things are. A bit tired, a bit haunted, but full of something that hadn't quite died yet. She unpacked slowly, folding sweaters and stacking books on the small side table. She placed a photo of her mother on the dresser, then lit a small beeswax candle, not for the scent, for the comfort. Downstairs, Graham moved through the house with his usual quiet routine. He didn't hover, but he noticed. He noticed she hummed softly when she cooked, that she used her hands when she spoke, but only when she was truly invested in what she was saying, that she lined her shoes by the back door neatly, every time. She never asked for permission, never assumed her place, but somehow she fit. One night, 2 weeks in, they sat on the back porch after dinner. The air was crisp, and the stars had started coming out. Marin had her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. Graham held a glass of scotch, but hadn't taken a sip. I thought you'd be different, he said quietly. Marin raised an eyebrow. How so? I thought you'd fill the space. Try to take it over. She tilted her head. Curious? Is that what people usually do? He nodded. They try to fix what they don't understand. There was a long pause. Then Marin spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes silence isn't a void. It's just a place that hasn't been named yet. Graham looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to speak back. As December deepened, so did the rhythm between them. Marin started tending to the greenhouse abandoned since Charlotte's death. She cleared out the frostbitten debris, restored the shelving, brought in herbs and hardy winter plants. She didn't ask Graham for permission. She just started with rosemary. He noticed it one morning on the windowsill, quietly thriving in a ceramic pot that didn't match anything in the house. But it made sense. Just like her. They didn't talk about feelings. Not directly. But they shared quiet things, meals, late-night glances, footsteps echoing softly in the halls. Graham started sleeping better, not because she was in the room, but because she was in the house. And somehow, the walls didn't feel quite as heavy anymore. One evening, while reviewing documents in his study, Graham found a piece of paper tucked between the folders on his desk. It wasn't addressed to him. It wasn't signed, but it read, "You don't have to let people in, but maybe don't lock yourself out." He didn't ask her about it, but he kept the note, folded neatly, inside his wallet. The snow arrived in silence, thick, soft, and without apology. By mid-December, the landscape around the Whitmore estate was blanketed in white. Pine trees bent under the weight, and the world looked as if someone had pressed pause on everything harsh. The hills, the trees, even the wind slowed inside the house. The rhythm between Graham and Marin had settled into something neither of them could quite name. They shared space now, not just in rooms or routines, but in the kind of small, unspoken ways that take time to notice. A hand brushing the counter just after the other passed. A coffee mug left beside the kettle. Ready. A scarf draped over a chair. Familiar but not intrusive. And then, without warning, something broke. It started with a smell. Graham walked into the kitchen one evening, after a long day at the office in town. Marin had cooked again. She never asked. just did it. Sometimes it was soup, sometimes toast and eggs. Tonight, it was roast chicken with rosemary. He froze in the doorway. The scent. For a moment, the room shifted. The warmth, the softness, the faint music playing from the old radio. It pulled something out from beneath his skin. Charlotte used to make rosemary chicken every December, always with mashed potatoes and a glass of Pinot Noir. He blinked, the air catching in his chest. Marin turned around, her smile soft, apron dusted with flour. I made enough for don't cook that again. The words came out sharper than he meant. Marin straightened, startled. I'm sorry, I said don't make that again. His voice didn't rise, but it cut. There was a long pause, the kind that fills the room with something heavier than noise. Marin took off the apron slowly, folding it over her arm. Okay, she said gently. I didn't know. He nodded once and left the room. Later that night, she knocked on his study door. He didn't answer, but she spoke anyway, her voice soft through the wood. You don't have to tell me why, but if something hurts, just say so. I'm not here to heal you. I just don't want to hurt you more. He sat at his desk, hands folded, listening, but didn't reply. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at himself for forgetting how grief could sneak up in something as simple as the scent of rosemary. The next morning, she didn't make breakfast. The kitchen was clean. Her mug was gone. So was she. He found her out, back in the greenhouse, sleeves rolled up, dirt on her jeans, planting something new. Her breath fogged in the cold, and her fingers moved gently across the soil. He didn't speak, just stood at the door. She looked up. I know, she said, wiping her hands. It's not mine to fix. He wanted to say thank you, but instead, he nodded and turned away. That week, something shifted again. Not colder, not distant, just quieter, but not in a way that felt empty. More like two people learning the limits of each other's ghosts. One night, a package arrived for Marin. She opened it by the fireplace. Inside was a small blue blanket and a note from the care facility where her mother stayed. The handwriting was shaky. For when the nights get cold, love, I'll always be your warmth. Marin read it twice, then held the blanket to her chest, her knuckles white, eyes fixed on the fire. Graham watched from the hallway, unseen. She didn't cry, but she didn't move for a long time either. The next morning, a quiet message appeared on the whiteboard they kept near the fridge. Snowstorm coming. Don't go out. We'll cook together tonight. Your call on the recipe. It wasn't signed, but it didn't have to be. That night, they made vegetable stew. Marin chopped onions, and Graham peeled carrots. The kitchen was filled with soft music, gentle clinks of knives, and the occasional dry joke. At one point, Marin laughed just once. Not loud, but real. Graham didn't look at her directly, but something inside him cracked, like ice beginning to melt underfoot. Not enough to fall through, just enough to feel the water underneath. After dinner, she set the blanket her mother sent over the back of the couch. He sat beside it, brushing his fingers lightly against the edge. Not enough for her to notice, but enough to remember. The snow didn't stop that day. By afternoon, it had thickened into a quiet storm, coating everything in soft white silence. The road to the Whitmore estate disappeared under drifts. Trees stood like sentinels, dusted in frost, and the sky hung low, as if the clouds had come down to listen. Inside the chapel, only 6 people sat, scattered in the pews. No photographers, no champagne, no press. just vows, and two people standing before a pastor, their breath visible in the winter air. Graham wore a charcoal gray suit. Simple. No tie. He hadn't touched the cufflinks Charlotte once gave him. He left them in their velvet box, unopened, in a drawer that hadn't been touched in years. Marin wore a soft ivory dress that looked like it had lived a life before her. Its lace sleeves were slightly worn at the edges, and a silver hairpin held her hair half up. She carried no bouquet, no veil, only a quietness in her eyes. They didn't hold hands during the ceremony. They didn't look at each other too long. But when the pastor asked, "Do you enter this agreement willingly?" they both said, "Yes." Not loudly, but clearly. After the brief ceremony, they rode home together in silence. Graham drove slowly, the tires crunching against snow-packed roads. Marin sat beside him, her fingers folded calmly in her lap. Back at the house, a fire already burned in the hearth. Harlan had arranged dinner, simple dishes kept warm on the stove, but neither of them ate. It wasn't that they weren't hungry. They just didn't know what to say yet. That night, Marin stood at the threshold of the hallway. Her guest room waited at the far end, quiet and lit by a single lamp. Graham stood in the doorway of his own room, watching her, not expectant, not cold, just waiting. She didn't move toward him. He didn't ask her to. She gave a small smile, not quite shy, not quite sure, and turned toward her room. But before she stepped away, she spoke. "Can I sit for a while?" He nodded. They sat in the living room, across from the fire. Marin held her knees close to her chest, wrapped in the soft blanket from her mother. Graham leaned back in his armchair, a glass of untouched bourbon in his hand. Neither of them spoke at first. The fire cracked gently. Outside, the wind hummed low against the windows. Then Graham said, almost to himself, "I haven't sat with anyone like this in 10 years. Marin didn't press. She just looked at him, her eyes soft, steady. He stared into the flames for a while, then began. She was driving back from her sister's place. I told her to wait until the snow cleared. But Charlotte..." He paused, breath catching. She hated being told what to do. A bitter smile touched his lips. "She called me stubborn, said I was always trying to control the uncontrollable. Like weather, like grief, like time." Marin didn't interrupt. He kept going, voice low. "I got the call at 3:14 in the morning. Black ice. The car hit a tree. The EMT said she was still breathing when they pulled her out, but she didn't make it to the hospital." His voice cracked on that last word. He cleared his throat, shook his head. "I never went back to the site. I never opened the box they gave me with her things. I couldn't." Silence settled around them, like a blanket, heavy, warm, necessary. Then Marin whispered, "You don't have to be ashamed for grieving slowly." Graham looked at her, eyes wet but not falling. "It's been 10 years, he said. "You'd think it wouldn't hit like this?" Marin leaned forward, resting her chin on her knees. "Grief doesn't tell time," she said. "It just lives where love once did, quietly, waiting for a moment to remind you." They sat like that for a while. No kiss, no embrace, just presence. A quiet agreement to share the room, and maybe the weight. Before heading to her room, Marin stood and gently laid her blanket over his shoulders. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore." Graham looked up. "Graham," he said quietly. "Just Graham." She gave him a nod, a flicker of something kind in her expression. then walked away down the hall, her footsteps soft, steady, fading. He stayed by the fire for a long time, not to mourn, but because, for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in the grief. 3 weeks after the wedding, the snow began to melt, just slightly, barely enough to reveal slivers of dead grass beneath the blanket of white. But it was a sign, a shift. Graham noticed it one morning while standing on the porch, coffee in hand, eyes on the trees. Spring always arrived in whispers. He turned back inside to the sound of soft humming Marin. In the kitchen, elbow deep in a recipe from a dog-eared book she kept tucked by the stove. Her hair was braided that day, and she wore a thick sweater, sleeves rolled to the elbows. It felt, impossibly, like something close to domestic. He didn't say it aloud. He didn't have to. Some things were better left unnamed. That afternoon, the knock came. Firm, sharp. Not the usual rhythm of delivery drivers or quiet estate staff. Graham opened the door to a man in a long wool coat, tailored and far too polished for Montana's wind. His name was Benjamin Greer, a journalist with the Chronicle, a business and political magazine Graham had no interest in. "I'm here for comment," Greer said, flashing credentials. "About your new wife." Graham's jaw tensed. "You can leave. Are you aware that Marin Clark once dated your former acquisition rival, Elliot Vance?" The name landed like a crack of thunder. Elliot Vance, aggressive, calculating, and the man Graham had once nearly sued over stolen assets during a failed merger 4 years ago. Greer didn't wait for a reply. She lived with Vance for almost a year. Their breakup was dramatic. According to sources, there were claims she had access to sensitive project drafts, leaks that conveniently benefited Vance during the Redmond deal. Graham didn't respond, but the grip on his coffee mug tightened until the ceramic cracked. "Interesting woman. Your wife," Greer added, smiling. Very convenient timing. He didn't confront Marin right away. He didn't want to believe it. But the seed had been planted, and Graham had learned the hard way that trusting the wrong person could cost everything. By evening, Marin noticed the shift. He was quieter, eyes more distant, the usual warmth in his voice gone. "Is something wrong?" she asked gently. "No. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the truth." 3 days passed in stillness. Marin gave him space, but she felt it. The pull, the retreat, the subtle closing of the door they had just barely cracked open together. Then, on the 4th morning, she walked into the study and found a folded article on her seat. She read the headline, "Billionaire's Bride Hidden Past of Marin Clark Raises Questions." She read every line, every assumption, every twisting of her past into something weaponized. When she looked up, Graham was standing by the fireplace, arms crossed. "You could have told me," he said quietly. "About Vance." Marin swallowed. Her voice stayed calm. "I didn't think it mattered. That part of my life was over." "Was it?" he asked. "You lived with him? You worked for him?" "Yes," she said evenly. "Until he tried to use me, I left. I moved across the country and started over. I never took anything from him." Graham didn't look convinced. "And the Redmond leak? I had nothing to do with it." He nodded slowly, but his silence spoke volumes. That night, Marin didn't come to the living room. She stayed in her room with the door closed. And Graham, he didn't knock. He sat alone by the fire, holding the same bourbon glass from their wedding night, though he never drank from it. At some point after midnight, he opened the drawer in his study. Inside was the small notebook Marin had left on the kitchen table days ago. It was filled with sketches, garden layouts, little notes, pages of thoughtfulness. On the inside cover, written in soft pencil, "Start again. Not because you forgot, but because you still remember and choose to hope anyway." He closed the book gently, but didn't go upstairs. The next morning, she was gone. Not gone, just not in the house. Her car was still in the driveway, but the greenhouse was empty, the garden untouched, her room quiet. Only a single note sat on the kitchen table. "I won't defend my past, but I never lied to you about who I am now." She spent that day at the care facility, where her mother stayed quietly reading aloud by the window, feeding her soup, brushing her hair. She didn't speak about Graham, not once. But her eyes looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept, not because of guilt, but because of the ache of disappointment. That night, Graham stood in the greenhouse under the cold glass ceiling. It had been Marin's world, her place of softness. He looked around at the rose she'd begun to restore, the rosemary, the lavender, the tiny sprouts she labeled with pencil on reused popsicle sticks. He saw a note she had pinned above the potting bench. "You don't need to bloom for someone to see your worth." He read it twice, then closed his eyes and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd done. He had believed the world too easily, but not her. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest betrayal of all. Not hers. His. The wind had changed. Montana in late January was still blanketed in snow. But something in the air felt different, more brittle, more still. Graham stood in the greenhouse just after sunrise, hands deep in the pockets of his coat, staring at the half-frozen rosemary Marin had planted. The frost had crept in through a small crack in the window, biting into the edges of everything green. It looked like him, something once growing, now curled inward, trying to survive the cold. Harlan Myers arrived that morning, unannounced. Graham hadn't seen him since the wedding. But there he was, same long coat, same leather briefcase, same unreadable expression. "I saw the article," Harlan said. Stepping inside, Graham didn't answer. "I also saw your silence," Harlan added. "You didn't defend her." Still, Graham said nothing. Harlan reached into his coat and pulled out a file, thin, manila, weathered. "I wasn't going to show you this," he admitted. "Marin didn't want you to know. Said she wasn't trying to be remembered for something she did when no one was looking." He placed the file on the table. "But now I think maybe you need reminding about who she really is." Inside the folder were 5 pages. A park ranger's emergency report from Glacier National Park. An anonymous call log to the local rescue team. A photo from a helicopter, taken 10 minutes before Graham was airlifted. And a note. "Man in black jacket, found unconscious near River Bend. Car off the road. I pulled him out and stayed until help arrived. He hit his head. Might not remember. Just wanted to make sure he didn't die alone. No name left." Graham sat down slowly. His fingers tightened around the edge of the paper, heart pounding harder than it had in months. He had forgotten that week, or maybe he had forced himself to. The crash was small, barely a blip in his public timeline. He'd been driving back from a board meeting. Distracted, lost in grief, took a turn too fast on a snow-covered road near the park. His car had gone off the embankment. He had woken up in the hospital with stitches, bruises, and no memory of who found him. But someone had. Someone who stayed. Someone who chose not to be seen. "She was there," Graham whispered. Harlan nodded. She pulled you from the wreck, called for help, sat with you for nearly an hour until the Rangers came. Why didn't she tell me she didn't want you to feel indebted? She didn't want the past to change your present. Graham looked down at the file again. Throat tight. She saved my life, and all you gave her was doubt. That night, Graham sat alone in Marin's room. Not to intrude, just to feel her presence again. The walls were simple. A stack of well-worn books sat beside the bed. A woven scarf hung neatly on a hook by the closet. The candle she lit each night, unburned now for days. He sat on the edge of the bed and ran his hand across the cover of her notebook. The sketches, the quotes, the soft hopes she never spoke aloud. He turned to the last page. A single line, in small, careful handwriting. Even the frozen things remember how to bloom when someone believes they can. The next morning, Graham drove to the care facility in Billings. It had been a week since she left. When he arrived, the nurse at the desk smiled gently. She's with her mom. Room 112. He knocked softly. Inside, Marin sat by the window, sunlight catching in her hair. Her mother slept peacefully nearby. She looked up, saw him, didn't smile, didn't speak. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. I know about Glacier, he said quietly. Marin didn't flinch, just looked out the window. You saved me. Sat in the cold, called for help. You didn't even leave your name. I wasn't trying to be remembered, she said softly. I just didn't want you to die alone. He stepped closer, voice rough. And then, I made you feel alone. In my house. In my silence. She finally met his eyes. Yes. Graham's throat tightened. I was afraid, he admitted, of being used, lied to, again. But you never asked for anything. Not even recognition. Marin nodded slowly. I didn't need you to believe in my past, Graham. I just needed you to believe in who I am now. He knelt down in front of her chair. Not dramatic, not rehearsed, just real. I believe you, he said. Marin looked down at him, still unsure. And I'm sorry it took losing you to realize I already had everything I was looking for. A long silence filled the room. Then, finally, she whispered, You're not the only one who was afraid. He reached up and gently took her hand. Neither of them said the word forgiveness, but it was there, quiet, warming the room. The days that followed weren't filled with grand gestures. There were no roses, no serenades, no dramatic speeches on snowy hillsides. Instead, there was a steady rhythm of quiet return, of presence, of showing up. Graham began driving Marin to the care home twice a week. He didn't ask to come in. He'd wait in the parking lot, reading the newspaper with the heater on, thermos of coffee by his side. Sometimes, Marin would step out and sit with him for 5 minutes before going in. Other days, she'd bring him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. They didn't say much, but silence had never felt so full. At home, Graham started tending the greenhouse. It wasn't flawless. He overwatered the lavender once. The mint dried out when he forgot to cover it during a cold snap. But he kept going. He found one of Marin's handwritten planting charts tucked in a book, studied it, followed the notes she'd left in the margins. Give this one room to stretch. Talk to it, even if it's silly. Roots need rest too. And so, every morning, he'd walk in, roll up his sleeves, and greet the plants. Morning, Rosemary. You're looking less grumpy today. He didn't care how ridiculous it sounded. It made him feel closer to her. Marin returned to the house one Sunday afternoon. Without warning, she carried 2 bags of groceries and wore a soft blue jacket. Graham heard the door and stepped out of the study, unsure if he was dreaming. She looked at him, not with forgiveness, not yet, but not with anger either. "I figured the fridge was probably empty," she said. He stepped forward, unsure what to say. "Thank you," was all he could manage. She nodded, setting the bags down. "The rosemary survived," she added, glancing out the kitchen window. "Barely," he said, "but it's trying." Marin looked at him. "So are you," she said. And for the first time in a long time, Graham smiled, not the polite one, not the guarded one, but the one that reached all the way to his eyes. That night, she didn't sleep in the guest room. She didn't sleep in his either. She stayed up reading by the fire. Graham joined her an hour later, both of them wrapped in separate blankets, watching the flames. At some point, their fingers brushed. Neither of them pulled away. Over the following weeks, the house slowly filled with life again. Not noise, but life. The soft scrape of Marin's chair against the kitchen floor. The clink of dishes shared at breakfast. The hum of her voice when she folded laundry by the window. Graham didn't rush anything. He didn't ask for more than what she offered. But he noticed every single detail she allowed him back into, and treasured it, like a man who knew how easily it could be lost. One evening, Marin found a small wooden box on her nightstand. Inside a simple silver chain, with a tiny rosemary charm. No note. But she knew what it meant. The next morning, she wore it with her sweater, like it had always belonged. Graham didn't say anything when he saw, but his hand lingered slightly longer on her shoulder as he passed behind her. Weeks later, she took his hand while walking the field trail behind the house, not because it was cold, not because she was asked, but because she wanted to. They didn't call it love. Not yet. But they began treating each other like it. One evening, Graham stood at the back porch and watched Marin through the window as she watered the last of the winter greens. Her hair was pinned back, soft tendrils falling loose. He thought about Charlotte, about how grief used to feel like betrayal when joy crept in again. But not anymore. Not with Marin. Because Marin didn't ask him to forget. She simply stood with him long enough to make remembering less painful. That night, as they sat beside each other on the porch, Marin looked up at him. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. He turned to her. "Regret what? The contract? How it started?" He thought for a moment. "No." He said, "Because it brought you here, and I've stopped wishing for a different beginning." He reached over and gently tucked a piece of hair behind her ear. "I just want the rest of the story to be ours." March came early that year. Snow melted fast, turning the long Montana driveway into thick slush. The fields behind the Whitmore estate, once silent and white, now brimmed with patches of thawed earth and the first signs of green. Inside the greenhouse, Marin stood barefoot, pressing her palms to the warm soil of a new planter box. She had always loved beginnings, the kind that didn't make a sound, the kind you had to notice. Graham leaned against the doorframe, watching her. He'd learned how to wait, not the impatient kind, the kind that said, "I'll be here when you're ready." And lately, she had been ready more often, more openly. They cooked together, walked together. Some nights, they even fell asleep on the same couch, wrapped in their separate blankets, but leaning just enough to blur the line. The contract hadn't come up in weeks, but that didn't mean it was forgotten. It was Marin who brought it up again. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. They were walking the trail that wrapped around the edge of the property, sky blushing orange with late afternoon sun. "I've been offered something," she said. Graham slowed. "What kind of something?" "A design fellowship," she said. "In Vermont. 6 months. They saw some of my old work through a community grant submission." He stopped walking, turned to her. "You applied. I didn't think they'd call." He didn't say anything, but his silence wasn't quiet. It buzzed. She glanced down at the path. "I haven't said yes, but I wanted to tell you." "You wanted to leave?" "No," she said softly. "I wanted to grow." They didn't speak for the rest of the walk. When they returned to the house, she made tea. He poured himself a drink. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, the fire between them flickering like a third presence. "I thought we were building something," he said finally. "We are," she replied. "But something built out of fear will always need proving." Graham looked at her, brow furrowed. "You think this is fear? I think I came into your life as a condition," she said. "And I need to know who I am when I step outside of it." He stood, turning toward the window. "I almost lost you once," he said. "I'm not sure I can do it again." Marin stood too, slow and steady. "Then don't see it as loss. See it as a choice. I'm not running. I'm reaching." That night, Graham sat alone in the study, staring at the contract they once signed. It was still there, tucked inside a drawer, yellowing slightly at the edges. He pulled it out, read the final clause again. Both parties may terminate the agreement upon mutual consent, should love become more than obligation. He read it twice, then folded the paper and put it away, not in the drawer, but in the fire. 2 mornings later, Marin came downstairs with her bag packed. Graham was already in the kitchen, making coffee. 2 mugs sat on the counter, one with sugar, one plain. She set her bag by the door, then turned to him. "I'm not sure where this goes," she said, "but I know it doesn't end here." He walked over and placed the mug in her hand. "I don't want you to go," he said. "But more than that, I don't want to be the reason you stay small." Marin looked up at him, eyes glistening. "That's the most loving thing you've ever said to me." He smiled. "You haven't read my vows yet." She laughed softly, then leaned up and kissed him. Not a goodbye, but a "we'll see." She left at noon. The driveway was clear by then, the snow finally surrendering to sun. Graham stood at the top of the steps and watched her car disappear down the road. No part of him wanted to stop her, but every part of him hoped she'd return. Over the next weeks, he wrote her letters, not emails, letters, handwritten, sealed, and mailed every Sunday. Some had stories, some just one sentence. "I trimmed the rosemary today. It still smells like you. I watched the sunrise without you. It wasn't the same. You were right. Roots need rest too." She never replied, but she never asked him to stop. And then one morning, just as spring truly settled over the Montana hills, a letter arrived in return. It was short. "They asked if I had someone to thank for the inspiration behind my designs. I gave them your name." He read it 3 times, then folded it slowly, tucked it into his wallet, right next to the note she'd once left him. "You don't have to let people in, but maybe don't lock yourself out." And Graham smiled, because love had returned, even when she hadn't. Spring came slowly that year, not in bursts of color, but in quiet signs, the soft hum of bees near the greenhouse glass, the rosemary blooming again, fuller than before. The front porch swept clean each morning, even if no one visited. Graham noticed them all and waited. It had been 83 days since Marin left. He had counted, not out of obsession, but reverence. Every day she was gone, he chose to live like she might return, not because he needed her to, but because he wanted her to have something to come home to. One afternoon, while tending the new seedlings in the greenhouse, he heard tires on gravel. He looked up. A dusty red Subaru pulled slowly into the driveway. His breath caught, not because he was surprised, but because he had hoped every day for this moment and had learned to be patient enough to deserve it. She stepped out of the car, hair windswept, eyes soft. She wore the same silver rosemary charm he had once placed in a box on her nightstand. He didn't move, didn't run to her, just stood, heart wide open. She walked toward him, slow but steady, stopping only when they stood face to face in the garden she once revived. "I came back," she said simply. He smiled. "You didn't have to. I wanted to." He exhaled softly, the world slowing just for them. "Why now?" "Because I finally figured out what home meant," she said. "And it wasn't a place. It wasn't even a person." Graham nodded, understanding before she finished. "It's a choice," Marin whispered. "To build something with someone who sees you not perfectly, not without history but fully, and stays." He reached for her hand. She didn't hesitate. They walked through the garden. Everything was green now, new life everywhere. She noticed the updated greenhouse, better reinforced, better cared for. "I messed up the lavender," he said sheepishly. She laughed. "You tried. That's more than most." Inside, on the center bench, a small planter sat with a note taped to it. "Reserved Ma. Clark." She touched it gently, and for the first time since coming back, her eyes filled with tears. But she didn't cry because she was broken. She cried because she had never been more whole. That evening, they sat on the back porch again, the same place where, months ago, they shared soup, silence, and stories with no labels. Now, the silence was different, full of knowing, of memory, of forward steps. Graham turned to her as the sun dipped low. "There's no contract this time," he said. "Good," she replied. "I wouldn't sign it." He smiled. "Then I guess we're both free, but still choosing each other," she added. He looked at her, then out at the horizon. "Yes," he said, "every single day." Weeks later, Marin moved her sketchbooks back into the studio room upstairs, not as a guest, but as someone staying with intention. She rejoined the design fellowship remotely, teaching online and mentoring new artists. Graham installed a high-speed router in the barn so she could work outside when she wanted. He didn't ask for anything in return, but one day, she left a note on his pillow. "Let's plant tomatoes this year," and he knew what that meant. One early May morning, as the sun crept gently into their bedroom, Graham stirred awake to the scent of coffee and cinnamon. He walked downstairs and found Marin in the kitchen, humming softly. She turned when she heard him. "You're up." "Barely," he murmured. "I made your favorite." He walked closer, leaned in, kissed her cheek. "Marin, I never imagined I could love again." She paused, then turned to face him fully. "Neither did I," she said. "But maybe love isn't something that comes back." She touched her hand to his chest, over his heart. "Maybe it's something that was always there, just waiting for the right season." Sometimes, love doesn't come wrapped in grand gestures or perfect timing. It shows up quietly in the form of someone who sees your scars, not as flaws, but as proof that you've lived, lost, and dared to care again. This story reminds us that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to hope after disappointment, to trust after betrayal, and to love after loss. For many of us, especially in the later chapters of life, it's easy to believe the best parts are behind us. But what if the most meaningful connections come after the storms, when we are softer, wiser, and finally ready to love without fear? Graham and Marin didn't find love because they were perfect. They found it because they were willing to sit in the silence, hold space for each other's pain, and stay when it was easier to leave. So maybe the real question isn't, can we love again? But rather, can we still choose to grow, even now? And the answer, always, is yes. If it touched your heart, made you pause, or reminded you of something real, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more soulful stories to life, stories that heal, connect, and remind us that we're never truly alone. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and keep listening with your heart.